Willard Van Orman Quine is really the dean of contemporary American philosophy. He's its most senior and influential and important figure. In some ways, probably one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, in addition to being one of its most eminent logicians. Trained during the heyday of logical positivism by none other than Rudolf Carnap in its most powerful techniques and analytic tools, ironically, Quine has done more than any other thinker to undermine the tenability of logical positivism and the philosophic tradition that it claims to herald. The background of Quine's work, the historical moment, as it were constituted by a series of setbacks to the positivist attempt to reduce mathematics to logic. Principally, these were first the persistent anomaly of Russell's paradox. Bertrand Russell had created a paradox by formulating the set of all sets that are not self-members. Then the paradox emerges when we ask the question, is that self itself, that set itself, a self-member? And it obviously is paradoxical. It can't be answered either way satisfactorily. But far more important, actually, was the development of Gödel's famed incompleteness proof. This was a rather technical proof. It involved manipulations in a language known as piano arithmetic, which was used to model number theory. What Gödel did was construct a self-referential sentence in piano arithmetic that stated, "I am not provable." Therefore, if that sentence was true, then if it was true and not provable, you must be able to prove that it's not provable, which is a contradiction. But if it is not true, in which case it is not provable, then it is provable, in which case it ought to be true. The point of this was to show that mathematics ultimately could not be reduced purely to logic. And indeed, since Gödel's incompleteness proof, that project really has fallen into disfavor. Well, Quine has directed his criticism at what I would call the foundational or Kantian elements of logical positivism. Positivist linguistic analysis and epistemology tried to constitute itself as a first philosophy, in the sense that it sought to foundationally and unequivocally establish the meaning of expressions or discourse before the scientist could judge the viability or truth of such sentences. The positivist thus tried to set limits to the range of meaningful discourse, hence Ayer's famous elimination of metaphysics. And they did this for the sciences by means of linguistic analysis, just as Kant had tried to do the same project through the analysis of the conceptual scheme he thought embedded in the a priori categories of the human mind. And we could in fact think of the logical positivists as projecting that conceptual scheme that Kant found in the mind into the very structure of language itself. Well, this notion of language and the whole positivist program presupposed a rather peculiar conception, which was that any language or theory possesses a determinate meaning or contains fixed structural and conceptual features. Okay, what we're going to do in this lecture is look at a variety of the ways Quine assaults this position. First, in a very important essay in the text called From a Logical Point of View, called Two Dogmas of Empiricism. Then a somewhat more powerful attack, a more sustained attack, in this text, the Ontological Relativity and Other Essays. And then we want to look at what the implications of Quine's work are for the practice of philosophy and the nature of linguistic analysis. So let's begin with that discussion of the two dogmas of empiricism. The first dogma that we'll be looking at is the belief that there is a basic and fundamental distinction, which we saw in Ayer, between analytic and synthetic truths. The second dogma is what is known as reductionism, the belief that every meaningful statement about the world is equivalent to some statement that is a logical construct of terms referring to sense experience. Hence, we reduce our physical discourse to discourse of sense experience. All right, let's look at that first dogma. According to that dogma, an analytic sentence is true solely on the basis of meanings rather than facts. Such meanings, it is important to note, are intentional and not to be confused with naming or reference, which is extensional. So if I were to give you a proper name, The meaning of that is extensional. It refers to an object. If I was to, on the other hand, to use a word like power, love, or humanity, the meaning of that is intentional. In some sense, it's conceptual, is another word we might use. This is important for Quine because Quine is going to argue that the intentional meaning is in fact a sort of replication of the old Aristotelian notion of essence, right? Aristotle defined man as a rational animal by arguing that rationality was the very essence of man. The linguistic philosopher will tell you that man is a rational animal because the intentional or semantic content of the word man is rational animal, as opposed to its extensional meaning, which might be man is a featherless biped. Right? Every human you come across is a featherless biped. All featherless bipeds on this planet are humans, but no one assumes that that's the intentional meaning. That's merely has to do with reference. Okay, so let's examine these analytic truths. They fall into two classes. The first class are pure logical truths. Like, take, for example, the following sentence. No unmarried man is married. Okay. The second class, the far more interesting class, is exemplified by another sentence, no bachelor is married. Okay, that's a sentence based on intentional meaning. Intentional meaning because the intentional meaning of bachelor is presumably an unmarried man. Now, we might be able to argue that we could reduce that second sentence to the first sentence, turn it into a logical truth, by replacing synonyms, i.e. bachelor with unmarried man, and then we would have no unmarried man is married. Thus, the second and critically important class of analytic truths rests on this notion of synonymy, or sameness of intentional meaning. Now, that such terms as bachelor and unmarried man are synonymous by definition is to put the cart before the horse. Right? Because the lexicographic work of dictionaries presupposes the notion of synonymy and applies it empirically to actual usage. We find that people use the word bachelor in the same context that they use the word unmarried man, and hence we define them as synonymous. So aside from the cases where you explicitly define your vocabulary in a technical sense, definition in general rests on this earlier notion of synonymy. So how then do we analyze synonymy? Well, synonymy can't rest on the notion of interchangeability of expressions, because such interchangeability does not distinguish between intentional or cognitive meaning and extensional sameness. Again, we can recur to that case of man is a rational animal and man is a featherless biped. Thus, while bachelor and unmarried man are interchangeable because they presumably refer to the same objects, so is creature with a heart and creature with the kidneys, right? Because all creatures that have hearts have kidneys to purify the blood that the heart pumps. Yet no one would assume that the latter is said to be true by meaning, and thus synthetic rather than analytic. The point being that when we look at that relation between creature with a heart and creature with kidneys, we say that's true based on facts rather than concepts or intentional meaning. And the result for Quine is that synonymy appears to be a dead end. Now, we could pursue analyticity in another direction. Let's say that analyticity is defined as a relation between some sentences and a language or theory. Carnap, in fact, posited so-called semantic rules, especially in the paradigm case of artificial languages, which specify by one means or another all of the sentences which are analytic in L. You could simply list them on a page. The problem with this explanation of analytic is that the word itself is used in the definition, i.e. the semantic rule. If you simply eliminate the word analytic and say the semantic rules specify a certain set of truths in a theory, then we have simply replaced the unexplained word analytic with the equally unexplained phrase semantic rule. Okay. Well, analyticity ultimately is based on the presupposition that there are some sentences in our language which are true and have no factual basis. And while this seems intuitively reasonable, Quine argues that no hard distinction can be drawn demarcating such sentences from their synthetic or factual counterparts. In fact, that such a distinction exists is a dogma or metaphysical article of faith. Okay, let's turn to the second dogma, that of reductionism, which is strongly related to the first and in fact supports it. You'll recall the verification theory of meaning, which stated or presupposed that reductionism could show that statements or expressions are synonymous when they share the same method of empirical confirmation. So the relation between a statement and experiences which constitute empirical confirmation is thus said to be one of radical reduction. We reduce those sentences to the experiences which confirm them. Such reductionism claims that every meaningful expression can be translated into sentences about our sense experience. Now, we've seen this project throughout the history of empiricism. Locke, Berkeley, and Hume all tried to do this on a term-by-term basis. And as John Stuart Mill showed in the 19th century, they failed because not all of our words have straightforward reference. Okay. The logical positivists thought they'd found a solution to this. They realized that a term-by-term basis wouldn't work of such reduction, but perhaps you could do it on a sentence-by-sentence basis, which is why they focused on the unit of the proposition, which corresponds in natural language to the sentence. And the sentence is sort of the linguistic equivalent to a fact. One could think, in fact, of a fact as a sentence-sized description of the world. So, to pursue this project, Rudolf Carnap had tried to characterize or define physical objects in terms of a string of conjoined sentences about sense experience that took the form quality Q is at a particular point instant x, y, z, and t, where x, y, and z refer to your spatial location, and t refers to the time. And if you string enough of those sentences together, perhaps referring to this coffee mug, quality blue, quality warm, quality smooth, is at this particular location at this particular moment, then you would have defined the coffee mug in terms of its sense experiences. But Quine points out something problematic. In that sentence, the locution "is at" remains undefined. And as a result, the project fails. There is no sense equivalent for reducing that phrase "is at." The dogma for us persists in the belief that for any synthetic statement, any empirical proposition, there exists a unique range of sensory experience that would either confirm or disconfirm that sentence. This implies that every sentence stands before the tribunal of truth and experience on its own. Well, Quine rejects this on behalf of what he calls holism. Quine insists that our sentences face experience not each on their own, but as a whole, as a body. Indeed, we might think of this in one book he titles as a web of belief, right? Where the outside of our web is connected to our experience, and then we weave the interior of that web to account for changes at the exterior. Perhaps a more useful analogy he draws is that of comparing total science, or the sum of our knowledge, to a field of force. The boundary conditions of that field are our experience. Anomalous experiences force readjustments of the sentences in the field's interior. Nonetheless, the total field is sufficiently underdetermined by its boundary conditions so that any single recalcitrant experience leaves us with a lot of choices as to which of our sentences or beliefs to reevaluate. So when we experience an anomaly, the structure of our sentences, the structure of our belief is such that we have choices as to which of our old beliefs to change. We might think of our logical laws in this analogy as simply those sentences we place at the center of our field. And they are therefore those sentences which we are least likely or desirous to change. But no sentence is ultimately immune to revision. And while we must square the periphery of our field with experience, the chief considerations in doing that, in governing the arrangement of the interior of our field of force or of our beliefs, is the conservation of belief and simplicity, especially of laws. And I would point out that the reason Quine stresses simplicity and conservation of belief is not only to give support to earlier pragmatists like James and Dewey, but also for good Darwinian evolutionary reasons. Simpler explanations are easier to follow. When something goes awry, it is easier to find where the error occurred. Whereas positivists had allowed pragmatic considerations to rule over our choice of synthetic beliefs or scientific theories, right? They never believed that science gave us absolute or logical truth. By destroying that analytic synthetic distinction, Quine is opting for a far more thoroughgoing pragmatism. He's arguing that pragmatic considerations govern all of our beliefs. And indeed, if we think during the early part of the 20th century, when there was a real debate in physics over the nature of light, whether it was particular or a function of waves, Quine argued that if we hadn't resolved that problem through quantum physics, we might have reached a point where we would have revised our most basic logical law, that of excluded middle. When experiences are sufficiently recalcitrant, we even reweave that very interior of our web of belief. Okay. I want now to turn to really Quine's most powerful attack on positivism, and possibly his masterwork, Ontological Relativity and Other Essays. Now, Quine's thesis is that when we specify the entities in some theory or language, we'll call that the object language, the language that we are attempting to analyze. We do so by translating sentences with those entities into another background theory or language. We'll call that the meta-language, which is richer and more inclusive. And you could think of this in terms of the way you learn a foreign language. That would be the object language. You learn the reference and meaning of the terms in sentences in, say, French, by translating them into sentences in your home language, your meta-language, i.e. English. Okay. Now, we'll see that Quine is going to argue for a twofold ontological relativity, which is to say that the reference or ontological import of an object language, of a language we're studying, is always relative to the meta-language it is translated into. In our case, the meta-language of last resort is our home language, good old vernacular English. So the fundamental entities of an object language will depend on the meta-language we translate it into, and also the perspective we take in that language. We might think of this meta-language then as serving as a sort of conceptual coordinate grid for interpreting the object language. Let's look at this in the case of what Quine calls radical translation, which is the translation of a language of which we have no experience. And what Quine wants to demonstrate is that in such a case, translation will always, in some sense, be indeterminate. So take the case of a field linguist who finds a community of people who have never been discovered before, and they speak a completely new and hitherto unmapped or translated language. How do we tap into that language? Well, Quine argues we probably begin with observation sentences, sentences whose truth depends on the moment of observation, such as, I am currently walking along this podium, or I am currently holding this coffee mug up. That sentence is true on the basis of observation. So we're with our tribal peoples, and we see a rabbit go by, and our host points to it and says, Gavajai, Gavajai. So we've tapped into our language. We found the first term. Gavajai means rabbit. Or does it? Quine's point here is that that is assuming they have the same ontological structure that we do. In English, we think of the world as made up of three-dimensionally extended objects in time. But perhaps they don't. Perhaps their interest is not in complete animals themselves, but rather in the parts of animals. Okay? They perhaps sell parts of animals to other groups. So what they might actually mean is, Gavajai, there goes an undetached rabbit part. Well, we have a way of solving that. We take the rabbit, We have to learn, first of all, the logical particles or participles of the language. And we point to one ear and say, gavajai. Point to the next ear and say, same gavajai. If they say no, we know that it is undetached rabbit parts. If they say yes, we know that they're not referring to undetached rabbit parts, and therefore we finally do know that gavajais are rabbits. Or are they? There's another possibility. Suppose these are a people whose fundamental philosophy is Heraclitean. They're a process people, which is to say they don't believe in three-dimensionally extended objects. They believe in spatio-temporal slices. So what they mean when they say gavajai is, there goes a spatio-temporal rabbit slice. Or, better yet, it's rabbiting over there. Lo, it rabbiteth. Okay. So how do we know the answer to what they're referring to? Such translation, Quine argues, and all translation, in fact, hinges on choices of analytic hypotheses for translating the new language into our familiar idiom. But such analytic hypotheses are always underdetermined by the facts of linguistic behavior, both among the speakers of the new language and also by the underdetermination of the distinct analytic hypotheses that we have produced. We could produce equally consistent but contradictory analytic hypotheses that might produce equally effective manuals of translation. You define gavajai as undetached rabbit part. Someone else defines it as spatiotemporal rabbit sliced. A third defines it as our good old-fashioned rabbits. Which is right? What does our cagey linguist say? And Quine's great quip here is, a cagey linguist is a caged linguist. You can't actually find the answer to that question, nor do you need to. What you need is an effective manual of translation, which means that when you want a rabbit, you will get one. And either of those three options of translating gavajai will get you a rabbit by using the word gavajai when you want one. And in fact, we could think of this in less radical situations. In some of the languages we're associated with, take for example French. There's a two-word expression in French, ne rien, which is separated by a verb, which means nothing. Or does it? We could also define it as two separate words, where ne means not, and rien means anything. And therefore, ne rien would come out again to mean not anything or nothing. Well, which is right? Quine's point is it makes no difference. As long as you can use it in a sentence speaking to a Frenchman and be understood by him, which is to say get whatever you wanted done, get the correct response, then they practically mean the same for you. In Japanese, for example, there's another strange locution where we would say 5 cattle or 5 cows. They actually have a word between 5 and cattle or cows, which can either be interpreted as modifying the word 5 so that it can now be used to count cattle, or modifying the word cattle so that it could be now used to count, now be used to count, as we would with, say, the word herd. Well, which is the right way to interpret that word? And again, Quine's point is there is no right way. As long as you can purchase the correct number of cattle on a Japanese exchange, you're satisfied. So, what have we seen? The ontology of an object language is also relative to the analytic hypotheses for translation into the meta-language, and what counts as a logical as opposed to a factual truth will vary both with the meta-language as well as the analytic hypotheses. And the result is that the distinction between such truths, analytic and synthetic, is again undermined, as is the distinction between metaphysics and science. Now, some of these points had in fact been argued by Wittgenstein, who had claimed that we might think of language as following games, and therefore there is a certain indeterminacy of translation, which is not critical as long as we can play the games we want. But he thought that, especially in our own home language, our home language has revealed our pre-systematic ontological awareness. But Quine's thesis is far more radical. He argues that even in our own home language, our reference can go inscrutable. How am I to know that you have not always believed in spatio-temporal slices, and that you've not always used proper names to refer to such things? And of course, If you have been doing that all your life, it really has no import, as long as you've been communicating effectively. Which is to say, at a more formal level, we can't fix the ontology of our own language, our home language, because there's no richer meta-language to translate it into. There's no larger conceptual coordinate grid to map the sentences of our own home language onto. So finally fixing the reference of our home language is like asking for absolute position or velocity, which we know in the post-Einsteinian age is, in fact, meaningless. Position and velocity are always relative, and so is reference, even in our home language. I want now to mention what some of the implications of Quine's theses are. The result of these doctrines of such ontological relativity is that philosophy as a foundational analysis of linguistic meanings prior to scientific study is rendered impossible. Okay? In fact, it's not even clear that there is anything left called philosophy which is distinguishable from science. Therefore, Quine offers us another project, a project to put in the place of traditional philosophy, particularly traditional foundational philosophy. And that is one which immediately brings to mind John Dewey. It is a project he calls epistemology naturalized, very similar to Dewey's naturalistic epistemology. This is an empirical study, a scientific study, of how a particular species, Homo sapiens sapiens, uses its symbolic systems to erect scientific theories and explanations. Such a theory or such a practice would obviously have connections to a whole host of different disciplines. And in this way, philosophy would not be a sort of judge standing above the other disciplines and criticizing them, describing what is and what is not valid. It would instead be a sort of handmaid running between the disciplines, drawing on the insights of each. To engage in an epistemology naturalized would mean understanding experimental psychology and showing how it relates to such phenomena as the sociology of science that we find in Thomas Kuhn's, the sociology of knowledge that we find in perhaps other figures like the late Alvin Gouldner. It might connect to our understanding of, say, cognitive psychology. It might relate to, as well, a whole host of other humanistic and scientific disciplines. It's also worth noting that such an account of epistemological account, naturalistic one, of how humanity builds up its own species, it builds up its knowledge, I should say, would have to account for itself, as well as the rest of our beliefs. Presumably, it would search for causal connections between language and the non-linguistic parts of the environment. I say non-linguistic because such a conception assumes that language is not a medium of representation that stands above the world. It is, in part, a piece of the world. Perhaps the most critical piece of the world in our cultural evolution. So what have we seen? We've seen first that fundamental distinction between analytic and synthetic that Kant had championed, that had served as the basis for a foundational understanding of philosophy, that could prescribe for us before analysis what science and truth consists in, is no longer tenable. We've also seen that traditional Oxford-style linguistic analysis, a way of understanding the structure of the world by finding it as replicated in the norms and syntactical rules of our language, will not produce for us any metaphysical insight, precisely because such interpretation is always ontologically relative. What we're left with is a conception of philosophy which is clearly empirical, is clearly cross-disciplinary, and is clearly naturalistic. One might, in that sense, think of Quine as taking the entire Anglo-American tradition of empiricism and naturalizing it, of bringing it to a certain fruition and closure, and leading it forward in a project which presumably is deeply evolutionary and connected to our biological understanding of ourselves as a distinct, knowing, cultural species.